Good evening and welcome to this wonderful festival. You may not notice it because you're in New York, but plants actually dominate the Earth's environment. They make up about 80% of Earth's biomass, and by comparison, all animals, including us, amount to less than 0.5%, or as one plant biologist puts it, just traces. So we want to begin with a question: how have plants managed to be so successful when they don't have any brains? Or do they? Can plants learn, think abstractly, even communicate? To begin, let's start with a little film about the checkered history of the study of plant intelligence.
Look, let's be honest. The idea of intelligent plants seems like a flashback to the 70s, when many believed that plants enjoyed listening to music and having us talk to them. Those ideas had their roots in the work of this guy, Cleve Baxter.
Welcome to the Baxter School of Lie Detection.
A former CIA lie detector expert who claimed he could communicate with plants telepathically.
I have to get a certain distance away from my lab so that my consciousness won't affect the results.
Baxter's research was popularized in a book, The Secret Life of Plants, published in 1973, which also claimed that plants prefer classical music to rock and roll, and that they have emotions.
The plant attached to the instrument is able to feel the mutilation of its comrade.
The Secret Life of Plants. It was insane, but very popular. It was a huge bestseller. It turned out to be full of pseudoscience, and I think gave a bad name to the whole area of inquiry.
It was a major setback to a field pioneered by Charles Darwin in the late 1800s.
Darwin was convinced that plants had an intelligence.
He proposed that this intelligence resided in their root tips. Later, in the early 20th century, scientist Jagadish Chandra Bose demonstrated that plants were aware of their environment and responded to electrical stimulation. And time-lapse photography offered a new perspective on their behavior.
Time-lapse is amazing because plants operate in a different scale of time than we do. We're continually being surprised by what they can do and how sophisticated they are to send signals to one another, to trade information and trade goods. This is two bean plants, and they're sensing one another and competing over this pole, and they're not both going to get it. And you'll see that one of them gives up on that pole and starts looking elsewhere. So how are they aware of each other in space? I don't think we know yet.
There is growing evidence of plants that communicate, learn new behaviors, compete for resources, and even respond to attack. And it's not just plants. Fungi appear to share resources and information through a wood wide web, a microscopic network of tree roots and mushroom fibers, leading us to wonder if it's time to expand the definition of intelligence to include organisms with no brains at all.
How many people here talk to their plants? Well, our first participant, I don't know if she does, but I wouldn't be surprised because she does amazing work and is willing to go out on the edge. She's a professor of evolutionary ecology at the University of Sydney in Australia. Her work is raising profound questions about plants and their ability to communicate, learn from experience, and cooperate. Please welcome Micah Gagliano. Our next guest is a professor of forest ecology at the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where he studies the wood wide web, a phrase I love, a hidden network of underground fungi that connect plants and trees. Please welcome Tom Horton. Rounding out our first group of guests is a professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, where he directs the Swarm Lab. He is a biologist who studies collective behaviors in slime molds, army ants, and robots. Please welcome Simone Garnier. So let me start with you, Monica. You've done pioneering work to help establish the field of what's called plant bio-acoustics. And one of your first experiments involved chili plants. Can you tell us about this and what you were trying to answer and what you found?
Sure. Well, first of all, that was indeed my first experiment with plants, because I used to work with animals. And by training, I'm an animal ecologist working with fishes on the coral reefs. So I didn't really know anything. I still don't know very much about plants. But, they are teaching me, so that's good. And so when I approached the question of communication in plants, which, of course, in the animal fields is really an easy question to ask because we ask it all the time, I started from, okay, so what do we know, if we know anything about communication in plants? And there were three main channels. Plants, we knew they use light to tell who is growing next to them and whether it's a problem or not. They use, of course, chemicals and touch. Basically, if they bump into each other, they know that that's no good, and depending who they're bumping into, they will change their behavior too. So I thought, okay, so what happens if I shut down those possibilities of communicating? Would they still know who is growing next to them? So I used chilies, just because they seemed easy to grow. That was the very deep and meaningful reason. And then I used basil plants as the good companions, and the fennel, which is known in companion planting for anyone that has got a garden. Fennel can be quite aggressive, and so usually is not planted in the veggie patch with everyone else. And so I thought, okay, so fennel is going to be my bad guy, and basil is the good guy. And I wonder if the chili knows who is inside the box. And so I created these matryoshka of boxes that would, lock up the plants into like, okay, I can't see you, I can't smell you, I can't touch you. Would I know, as a baby chili, who is there? And they did. And so then I was like, oh, no. And now, so then, of course, as often is the case, and when you stumble in those places, like, oh no, now I think you are onto something, even if you don't know what it is. And so basically, I was like, okay, so obviously they know, and obviously they must use some other way of knowing that is not what we already know about them. And so I because of my animal background, I kind of went into like, oh, maybe sound, because sound in animal ecology is used everywhere we've looked. Maybe there are other channels as well. And so the bioacoustic kind of developed from stumbling into like, I don't know what's happening here. But it's often the case in science, I would say, right? So, yeah.
So you discovered that they were tuning into the sound of...
They knew exactly who was growing next to them, yeah.
And then you also discovered that plants not only respond to sound, but also make sounds. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I guess that one was the more disturbing part for many of my colleagues. Because one thing is like, oh, well, okay, they might respond to the sound surrounding them, and it kind of makes sense. But the fact that they might produce their own sound, so they have their own voice, which is different than plant singing or plant making music, just to clarify. Yeah, and actually this work was done with colleagues in Bristol, and they were also animal ecologists working with insects of all things, and they were looking at how the antenna of certain insects, including like tiny mosquitoes, pick up vibrations and produce their own vibrations. So we use the same technology, which is laser technology, and basically we checked plant roots instead of mosquitoes' antennas. And then, of course, there was the signal, and it was like, what are we going to do with this now? And this is the signal. It's looped because we only had brief times, but yeah, this is how a plant sounds like when it's producing its own sound. Of course, it's loud at this stage, but the frequency is within our audio range as well, and which means that potentially our ears actually could hear this. It's just that the amplitude, so the volume of that sound is not very loud, and you can imagine roots are under the ground. So, when people ask me, "Oh, so do you think that I could hear it?" I say, absolutely. If you're ready to put your ear on the ground, be super quiet, and wait. And most people say, "Oh, okay, I believe you."
Take your word. Well, I imagine that your colleagues were skeptical about this, to say the least. How did
Be
they?
very kind.
So, is the field of plant bioacoustics now, you think, considered wholly legitimate?
What are you laughing at?
Laughing at the question, not at the.
Okay, good. Like is often the case in science in particular, but I think in many spaces of human endeavor, at the beginning is always tiny steps and hard and that kind of thing. And then suddenly one person and then another group, and then they start building. And as knowledge builds, we get more comfortable about the ideas, and then it's kind of like, it's no-brainer. It's like, we knew that. And philosophers,
Did you prepare that one?
Yeah, I did. Philosophers have told us this before, and it's a history of science, and maybe not just science. And so I guess we are at a point when I'm starting to see and even send papers to review on this. I know. And so the fact that they even consider me an eligible reviewer is amazing. But so the fact that there are these works coming through, it's a great sign. And I remember earlier on when, sometimes doing an interview and someone said, "So what do you hope out of this work?" And of course, often they think like, I become famous, or and I was like, I hope it becomes totally redundant, and it means that it's so obvious and it's so accepted that we're not even going to talk about this because it's just like a given. It's like, of course, we all know the plants make noise, So that still is my best wish to that science.
So, Simone, you work in something else that maybe people are skeptical about, that is intelligence of slime molds.
Yeah, now who's laughing?
All right.
So, but tell us what a slime mold is. It's not a plant or an animal. Is it a fungus? What is a slime?
It's not a plant, it's not an animal, it's not a fungus. It's not clear where it fits in the tree of life. Its little scientific name is myxomycete, I guess that's the way you would pronounce it. It's a very weird organism. There's no question about this. It's actually a unicellular organism that can be pretty big. All the yellow mass you see is one single cell here, and that can be several, you can grow it on several square feet if you have enough time and food.
And that's the single cell?
As a single cell. But unlike the cells you have in your body that all have a single nucleus, these can have millions and millions of nuclei inside. It's called a syncytium. It's a little name. And yeah, I mean, a little bit like you, right? I'm an animal behavior specialist originally. And the reason I study slime mold now is because I hired a guy a few years ago to work on ants, and then he came and said, I want to work on slime mold instead. I was like, fine, what do you want to do with it? And he was like, well, I want to have them play the casino. And I was like, all right.
Play the casino.
The casino. So we did an experiment where we had slime mold play the casino, and then the results were like the slime mold is actually pretty good at it.
Oh, yeah?
It wins against the casino. So slime mold is capable of solving this problem that seems to be typical problem that we normally ask to organisms with brains. I mean, this casino experiment is called the multi-arm bandit problem. It's something that is studied in pigeons and humans and all sort of brain animal. And then we showed that it's actually can be solved by organisms that don't have brains, don't even have neurons. And that's how we started. And then this summer we are very close to actually showing what are the molecular mechanisms allowing them to make these decisions. if you allow me to talk about this issue.
So, how do they do this? What are they doing?
So they actually use their muscles for that, which is kind of counterintuitive. Yeah, so the slime, if you have the video, if we can show the video again, and you might see that you have this pulsation. Right, this is actually so sped up, but this pulsation happens about every minute and a half in the slime mold, and it's actually the membrane of the slime mold contracting, expanding, and choosing actin myosin, which is the same type of proteins that are used by your muscles to contract. That's why I call them muscles.
Okay.
And that pulsation is essentially what helps the slime mold redistribute its biomass throughout its entire body. Now, what we seem to be happening is when the slime mold hits something that tastes good, it actually relaxes there. And just by sheer physics, right, everywhere else is pulsing, and so there's an influx of material is going toward that location where that started relaxing. So it makes decision by finding something nice and then relaxing there.
And it can also sort of solve mazes, too.
Yeah, so that's a very famous experiment. We actually won the Ig Nobel Prize back in 2001.
Ig Nobel?
If you don't know, the Ig Nobel Prize is a prize for science that first make you laugh and that make you think. It's not my prize, I didn't invent that. But yes, a group of Japanese researchers, they actually won for their research on slime mold twice the Ig Nobel Prize.
Oh.
First, for these experiments where they showed that if you put the slime mold on a maze, it's capable of actually finding the shortest path between the entrance and the exit of the maze, which is something that if you have a 3 or 4 year old at home, they're not capable of doing this yet. They will at some point. If they don't, then you have a problem. And then the second experiments that they've done, in which I think we have a sort of a video of that with the map of the US. Yeah, so that's sort of a recreation of that experiment. But this team worked on the Tokyo subway network. So they reproduced the Tokyo subway network using pieces of food, pellets of oat flake, which for some reason the slime mold loves. And they showed that the slime mold will create a network connecting all these different pellets. And the network, the property of the network, very, very close to a perfect network that engineers will design to connect different train stations in the Tokyo area. And that won also the Ig Nobel Prize. But these two experiments sort of kick-started this field in biology of the intelligence of slime mold and how they're capable of solving this problem. And that was just about 15 years ago now.
Do you see this as some kind of would you define this as intelligence?
I try to not use the word intelligence when I can. I use the word problem solving because I can define this as a problem. The problem in this case is, the case of the network, for instance, is balancing things like the cost of building the networks, but also the robustness of the networks to perturbation. And so that's a problem, a trade-off that they need to be able to solve. The question whether that is something that we consider intelligent, it depends on how... we can backtrack a little bit, but in the history of testing intelligence or measuring intelligence, we have created a battery of tests. And some of these tests are about optimizing this trade-off. And so the question is now, either we have to discard all these tests because slime mold passed it and decide that these tests actually don't test intelligence, or we have to admit that they are intelligent. But I will not pronounce on it because I want to be reviewed too. But yeah, it's essentially a question of they pass tests that we have given to brain animal, and then we have considered this test of intelligence. I'm guessing.
Well, and the word itself, just the actual root of the word, basically means choice between. So, if you choose to go that way instead of this way, and then you choose again, and then you choose again, and you're directing that choice to resolve a problem, then by that definition, you will be intelligent. But again, I agree with you. It's like problem-solving, decision-making seems a bit more appropriate, but not just for the slime mold or the plants or the whatever, but even for us,
They define the problem in a way that can be testable.
Yeah.
So Tom, you're working on sort of another part of this biological kingdom, looking at the interactions between fungi and trees. What is this wood wide web? And what is at the root of these networks?
Root of these networks. The roots. So the Wood Wide Web, I guess I could think of my own history through this. I was a plant ecologist first, and watching how certain trees a seed would land and get established here, but not over there, and find out that there were very different fungal networks underground that would support the tree here, but as a different group over there. And I was fascinated by that, and I started to dig in a little bit. Okay, we should just...
We're doing all night, right?
Just stop right there.
I gotta up my game because I'm not very good at it.
What I discovered is that plant ecology has largely worked in the absence of understanding what's going on below ground other than the roots. And so when we've tried to figure out how do nutrients get to plants, we either use a hydroponic system in the absence of the fungi, or we use something like a Arabidopsis, the lab rat of plants, that is in a family that doesn't form mycorrhizal associations. So here is a single seedling associated with one fungus. If any of you know your fungi, that's a Swillus. You wouldn't know because it's not making a mushroom on top. But that network is very much analogous to the Myxomycetes network, the slime mold. They're going after resources. You can see nodules with the root tips. They're getting all their carbon, so the primary resource is carbon from the plant. That's the sugar. And then that fan of hyphae are very actively searching for other nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And so you see this beauty, and you could put a little plug of nitrogen in one spot in that little microcosm, and the hyphae will hone in on that spot. And if you label that phosphorus, it shows up in the plants very quickly. The fungi harvest it, and it gets back up into the plants. I was fascinated by that. I thought, my gosh, let's read more about this. I looked in the botany text books I had.
No.
There's a paragraph on mycorrhizae. I looked in the ecology, and probably the word occurred, often spelled right. I was fascinated. This was back in, not long ago for some of us, 1990 or so. It's starting to get into the ecology textbooks. Sorry?
I was still in high school.
Oh, gosh. Listen, son. So I thought, what am I going to do for my career other than I get to study fungi, which I'd already had a fascination with this. I realized that plant ecology needed to I could get in there and understand the fungi and bring mycology into plant ecology. Mm-hmm. Jumping ahead, so that was a paper published in that journal by Suzanne Simard, which some of you may have heard, and if you haven't, you should really look up her work. She was showing with isotopes, that is labeled bits of carbon, that Douglas fir was communicating with birch. Wow. In mixed stands like you're seeing here. The birch is in fall colors, the Douglas fir is a conifer, obviously. And that communication is very active out in nature. I'm very interested in how that impacts seedling establishment during succession, say after a fire. But she has been showing that there's this communication in these forests. They are not static individuals. There's this larger holistic thing going on below ground that we've been walking right over. Sorry. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I couldn't resist.
That joke, right?
So it's okay.
So these fungi are sort
Sorry.
of acting like little electrical wires or pipes, or
I see them as highways. And going back to the next slide again, to the next, that one, you can see the highways. That's, let's see, I don't know my highway names here, but it's a throughway, and then there's city streets, and then there's places you can walk, and it just increasingly gets finer and finer.
Oh, watch out.
No, it's a honest question. So when you talk about communication, are you talking just like exchange of nutrients, or actually like signals that modify the behavior of the other partner?
Yes, so I'm talking about sharing or movement of nutrients.
Okay.
In my world, I feel that nitrogen and phosphorus are highly are moving throughout the networks. In the arbuscular, this is going to get a little bit too much in the weeds, but I'm going to try. In the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which associate with 70% of the plants that you see out there, so in a field, they're all interconnected through these mycelial networks. Doesn't matter how many plants are. This would be a meadow, though, not trees. they are all one cell. There are no septa,
Oh,
like your slime molds.
slime mold.
And there are thousands of nuclei. And when they make a spore, I've seen videos where the nuclei are moving along as the spore expands, and they're delivering thousands of nuclei into the spore. And sometimes the nucleus goes through the little branch and comes back out and decides not to. There's a lot we don't know. But if I can go to the next slide. So this is, remember, one individual of fungus. Here are two species. In the ectomycorrhizal world, where the trees are, at least in North America, the temperate forests, they are not all one cell, and nor do they really interconnect into one continuous stream. They're all, well, to put it in a, they're all in it for themselves, maybe one way to look at this. And you can see that these two hyphae are different species, and they are not connected. So they may be off the same tree. The nutrients may be going from the tree into both, but they're not interconnected. They're not utilizing each other's resource base. And the same thing for the fungi. They're after the phosphorus and the nitrogen. They're bringing it back to the tree, but they're not doing it together. They're not doing it as a single unit. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you, because you gave me a great soapbox.
Well, my question was about whether that communication affected the behavior of the
yeah,
other. Or if it was just an exchange of
Resources.
Resources.
Like, if I poke a plant here, will that modify the behavior of the plant?
That's a great question.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
So the one data point I could bring in from the research I'm aware of is that if a plant gets chewed on by an insect, and the experiment was elegantly done with all the controls in place, that plant can send signals that will go through the mycelial network, and the next plant will put up its defenses.
Prepare for battle.
And if you break the hyphal network by cutting them, it doesn't happen. And it's not going through the air, that signal. It's not going through the roots. It's going through the mycelia. So there is communication.
Yeah, that's really cool.
So it's kind of using it like infrastructure. It's really just taking advantage of it.
Yep, and published within the last 5-6 years maybe. So it's, and there's more. There have been many more papers on that.
The chemical communication both below and above ground is crazy. It's like it's happening at a rate, and it's mirrored in the literature, in the scientific literature, how many papers are coming out and how many different combination of studies and plants that have been looked at in that context specifically. So it's pretty cool.
But isn't it fascinating that we have the textbooks that we're using in, from high school up through the college, up through graduate level books that people are using, and they forget to mention the mycelial networks, the fungi.
Are you saying textbooks are behind their time?
They're a little, yeah.
Maybe it's time you write the next one.
Well, I have been involved, but it doesn't get fair play, and I've stopped being. No, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Do you
right.
see this as a kind of a symbiosis or somewhat like mutually exploiting each other? In
Oh,
some
that's great. I love that. So in my lab, we often throw that question up and we say, is this a mutualism? What is a mutualism? Reciprocal parasitism.
That's, what do you mean by that? That's just
So they're both, one organism needs the carbon. I mean, the plants don't need carbon. That's the number one resource that most of us need. But plants don't. They fix it. And they make a lot of extra, and they leak it down into the roots and support a microbial community. But they do need nitrogen and phosphorus. And it's the other way around for all the microbes. They need the nitrogen, they need the carbon, but they can get, with all that carbon from the plants, they can go out and explore and absorb through extracellular digestion the nitrogen and the phosphorus. A lot of enzymatic activity, movement of material through the hyphae, through septa, et cetera.
so it's not like some Gaia commune sort of relation.
Well, if I go back to when I started my master's, I was in San Francisco, and I was like, man, this is the 60s all over again. Just like that film, only jump back one decade. I was like, wow, this is so cool, I've got it. But then things started to get a little harder during my degree, and it became a little more competitive, shall we say.
So you did some experiments with the mimosa plant that I guess was also sending ripples through the field of plant biology, because it did suggest that there was learning and actually remembering it for a surprising amount of time. Can you talk about these experiments?
Well, I should clarify, it wasn't a suggestion, it was data-driven. So it was demonstrating, which is different. And I'm clarifying this because one of the typical comment that I would get about that study was, I don't believe you. And I'm like, okay, you don't have to. But can we talk about my data? I mean, are you a philosopher or are we doing science? Just, because, if we're talking about philosophy, then maybe, yeah, you're right. Depending on what is your vision of learning and memory and whatever, then maybe there is something there to discuss. But if we're talking just about the science of, and this is experimental science, so here is my experiment, here is my data, let's talk about that. And there wasn't much of a willingness to talk about the data, but the experiments was very clear, and it was Mimosa pudica, or the sensitive plant, which, of course, as you saw as well in the little video at the beginning, is, it was a plant that was used from Darwin to Bose and many others. And actually is a plant that even from the ancient times, it's always attracted our attention. Why? Because it moves at our time scale. And so we can actually see it doing something. And so it's like, oh yeah, mimosa does behave. Everyone else is just static and seen as a kind of object in the background. And that actually does have a term, and it's called plant blindness. And it comes from the education research, which has demonstrated that humans are kind of blind to plants. And since when we are little as well, so at school, kids find it very difficult to recognize plants, but they are very good at recognizing animals that they would never ever meet, like a lion. But if you show them a plant of like a tomato plant, they'll be like, I don't know. But anyway, that aside, and so mimosa was a choice because it was a good bridging point between, learning and memory is naturally associated to something that animals do. So using a plant or having a plant as a model for testing this kind of question that are normally restricted to animals was, a plant that moves was a good starting place, right? And the experiment was very simple because of what I did. I started looking at the most basic level of learning. And even within the animal literature, we talk about this kind of learning, which is, the technical term is habituation. And you're doing it right now because you're not paying attention to the lights, to the smell, to the temperature, to this and that. Like, oh, you are, but you have already decided that it's not going to kill you right now. So you can kind of ignore it. But if the alarm was going to go off right now, your body will be ready to respond. So the idea of habituation is that you are bombarded by all this information or signals, and your body is detecting them, and then kind of waiting. But this happens mostly unconsciously, waiting, to decide whether this is going to be a problem or not. And if experience tells you, look, you can ignore it, then you ignore it, and so that you can actually focus maybe on the person talking in front of you, or maybe not. Maybe you have just habituated to these two, and like, who knows? But the idea is very simple. Like, you can't pay attention to everything that is happening around you all the time because you wouldn't last very long. So you cut out, you remove the information that is irrelevant to you right now. But you want to be responsive in case some relevant bits of information arrives, like the alarm. So I did the same experiment, and I used mimosa, and basically the question was the same. It's like, if I do something that is kind of scary or disturbing at first, but it's not deadly, it looks like it could be potentially a problem, but actually, through experience, the plant should realize that nothing really happens. So this plant closes the leaves quite rapidly when it's disturbed. And so, as you just saw, I created this kind of torture thingy. But no plants were hurt, really, during the conduction of these experiments. So basically, I would drop the plant, and the base of that structure is foam. So the plant will be dropped from a set height. And of course, the first time that the plant is dropped, the plant closes the leaves, because it's like, what was that? Then you do it again, and then you do it again. And that's exactly what we would do if it was an animal. You know, you repeat, and you repeat several times. And in my what we call that repeat is a train. And the train for this experiment was like 60 drops consecutively. But what happened, as you can see from that cartoon, is that the plants actually, after 2, 3 of those supposed to be 60 drops, they were like, oh, I got it. I got it. Nothing is happening, and I'm not bothering closing my leaves. And it makes total sense because, of course, open leaves, full photosynthetic capacity, right? When you close your leaves, you might protect yourself from predators, for example, so that you look smaller, or these plants got spines that stick out when the leaves are closed. So, you know, it's you're defending. But if there is actually no danger, you're defending against nothing. But by closing, you are cutting away your opportunity to feed on light. And for this plant, when the leaves are closed, it loses like 40% of photosynthetic capacity. That's a lot, especially if there's no reason. And so in my experiment, actually, I had plants that were in an environment where there was lots of light. So making mistake is not that critical. You can make an extra mistake and it's okay. But there was a group of plants, sorry, that was actually in an environment where there was sufficient light, but not an abundance of light. So making the wrong decision there could have been more critical. And as you can guess, what the plants do is like when they are in good environments, they take their time to learn. They still learn, but they are slower. And, whatever. I can drop another time. While the one that are in low light environments, of course, there is an urgency to get it right, because that could be, in a real scenario, could be a really dangerous thing to do if you don't get it. And so those plants learn very quickly. And so you say, oh, excellent, plants, looks like they're learning the trick. So then what you do is like, I wonder how long they can remember this. Because memory is not a separate thing. Memory is an intrinsic aspect of learning. Learning is a process, and memory is one aspect of that process. So you leave them alone for a while, and then you come back, and like, I'm going to disturb you again. And the truth is that and this has happened to me a lot with plants. I don't know if you guys have the same experience with your critters, but my plants just, totally embarrass me every time. Because, the question would be like, would you remember what you had for dinner 3 days ago?
No.
Exactly. Me neither. I don't even remember what I ate this morning. I had difficulty for breakfast. So I was like... So I thought, like, 3 days. I come back in 3 days. That should be enough. They won't remember. And they did. Just as if we just did that. And I said, okay, then I come back in 6 days. And again, it was like, yeah, we know this trick. And I thought, fine then. So I left them for a month. And not only that, but I divided my original groups, low light, high light, in half. Some of the plants stayed in those groups where they, so the environment where they learned the trick remained the same as when then I tested them a month later. But the other half of each group got swapped. So some plants learned in a low light environment, but then they found themselves tested in a high light environment, and vice versa. And so, suddenly it's like, okay, so you learned the trick, but it's context dependent. So would you change what you're doing? And what was interesting, many things were interesting. One, that after 28 days, the plants were like, yeah, is the drop. Would you stop it? I mean, it's a bit annoying, actually, so if you don't mind. We got it. And so that was the first embarrassment. It's like, okay, great. And but the other really interesting thing was that, of course, the plants that stayed in the environment where they were trained, they just performed as expected. The plants that went from a low light environment, from a high light environment to a low light environment, so they learned in a comfy place, but then they found themselves in a not so comfy place. Well, those guys suddenly behaved as like, oof, the environment is gone bad. And so the response was very quick. But the interesting part was for the other group, the one that went from the low light environment to the high. And you was like, now you can relax. The environment is gone good, right? But they don't. And what's my suspicion is that what they're doing is like, not only they are learning the trick and they remember it, but they're also learning another aspect of that context, which is the environment changes. The environment can change, and it went from bad to good once, so it can return to bad again. So they remain on alert, as if it's like, okay, anytime now, it could just go back that way, and so we're ready. And they do this, and of course, there is no brain or neurons, and that is the part that is very disturbing.
But it
to some.
It turns out, though, that they're using some of the same sort of processes, like calcium signals, which are, how the brain cells work in us.
The real question is like the real answer is that we don't really know. That's the truth. But then we can pretend, and we can look at some of the chemicals that, as you're mentioning, some of the chemical and some of the substances that we have targeted as these are neurotransmitters. And like suddenly by giving the name neurotransmitters means that if you don't have neurons, you can't have the transmitter. But in fact, we actually share the same transmitters. And if we didn't call them neuron, we would have saved ourselves a big pain because they're exactly the same. So a lot of things like the famous things like dopamine, serotonin, and many other chemicals that we are quite familiar with and interact with our synapses and brain function and all of that are shared. And but by calling them in a particular, so the language itself is already locking us up in certain corners where then we need to come out of, and that's when we find it uncomfortable. But
so our tongues have calcium channels, and that's what makes them hot with peppers. The calcium channels open up. So my tongue actually often has a brain that I wish it didn't have. I say some crazy things, but I wonder if it's similar. I mean, calcium channels seem to be sort of in a lot of places, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like ubiquitous, right?
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Pretty much,
Yeah. So
and that's what I mean.
Not always
right?
neurotransmitters, so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. What is pointing at when we look at it without being too hung up to the language, of, like who cares if that's intelligent behavior or not? It's like, what is he actually doing, and what is the function? What is it? Why is he doing that? What is he doing that for? And then even how it's done becomes quite like, this is how fast when a plant. This is not my work, but it's how fast that signal can move when a plant is under attack. Right. So it's just that we haven't been able to see some of these responses, and because they are invisible literally to our eyes. And this plant in particular, which is the beautiful, lovely Arabidopsis.
It's not a plant because they don't form mycorrhizae.
But these are kind of responses that now, by playing with technology, we've been able to literally see. Right. But they've been occurring all the time. And the speed at which they are occurring might not be the same in all systems, but it's pretty fast, and relative to what it's useful in the context of that organisms, like for plants, which are not in a hurry, that's really fast.
But in slime mold, they also seem to learn and also transmit that learning to others, right?
Yeah, so I mean, that's what you're referring to is one of the most fascinating experiments of the past year, in my opinion. It was done by Audrey Dussuteau and her team in Toulouse, in France. And I don't know if we have the picture. That might be easier to explain. But essentially, it's an experiment of habituation as well, right? You have slime mold at the yellow mass at the bottom, And then the top part is actually a platform with food. And in between, there's this bridge that actually contains salt. And slime mold doesn't like salt. Like most cells, they don't like to move on salty things because that's pump out the water out of them. And in this experiment, Audrey managed essentially to train this slime mold to learn to cross that dangerous bridge to get to the food. That's not even like the coolest part of the experiment here, right? Slime mold, if you have a cell of slime mold, you cut it in half, and you have 2 slime molds. And then you put them back together, they fuse, and you have 1 slime mold again. So that's what she did. She essentially took this trained slime mold, cut a piece out of it, and then fused it with a slime mold that wasn't trained. And that new mixed slime mold, part that was trained, the part that wasn't trained, retained the memory, retained the behavior of the slime mold that was trained. And so that was this fascinating, like sort of mind-blowing idea that you can train a part of the organism, you cut it out, and then you mix it with a part of another organism that's not been trained, and then there is transmission of that memory between the 2 organisms as they fuse with each other.
Where is that memory being stored? I mean,
That is, we don't know, right? Like you have to imagine this is a field that is, we're still at the behavioral level. We're looking at the behavior of these organisms. We're trying to understand their behavior and observe and quantify it. But we haven't looked much into the molecular mechanisms and what are the molecules that are storing that memory there. We don't know.
I think this is great, and my work as well. In the classes and my students, there are so many times when I say, we really don't know the answer. They ask great questions. We really don't know. But it's a great time to be here because we're making incredible gains, and we've got all these tools. We just need enough people to ask the right questions. And it's a fascinating time, and I think on all of these to be involved.
I don't remember the name of the person who said that, but like science is being at the forefront of ignorance.
Oh yeah.
And I have to find that quote, like the person who said that. But
Isn't that the name of
we're really there. We don't know what's happening. But we are starting to have the technology and the tools and all the molecular mechanism, molecular tools to be able to get into the mechanisms inside the cell, and then try to figure out where the cells store that memory. It's probably not going to be stored the same way it is stored in neurons, or maybe it is actually.
And that's the thing is like what I find fascinating is that these systems, because they are basal, so they are, if you imagine the tree of life, these guys are all pretty much sitting at the base of the tree, at the root of the tree. And so in a way...
Well, no, technically they're all at the tips.
Well, compared to us, they are... And in a way, it's almost like, evolution likes to tinker with material and building blocks that are all available, right? So, if these guys are doing all of these things, then the building blocks are already there. And so how we memorize things at the most, fundamental level plays with the same, it's likely that it plays with the same building block, and understanding in this system might actually help us understand better what we are doing. Mm-hmm. And with all the beauty of our brain and our neural system. And so it's a win-win situation, because it's like we understand these organisms better, and they might actually help us understand better what we're already trying to understand about the human itself or the higher animals. No?
Mm-hmm.
So getting into our Act 3 here, which is collective intelligences. And so we're going to be talking about not just creatures that you wouldn't expect are intelligent, but the idea of bringing things together and having an intelligence just through collective action. And so we're going to bring in the next 2 people. One of them is a MacArthur Genius Award winner and professor of engineering at Princeton, where she studies collective intelligence in bird flocks, fish schools, ants, honeybees, zebra herds, and robots. So please welcome Naomi Leonard. And our final guest is a tropical biologist, author, and photographer, a research associate in the Department of Entomology at the Smithsonian Institution, and a visiting scholar at the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. Please welcome Mark Moffett. So, speaking of swarm intelligence, there are leafcutter ants. And I just actually was reading today that ants have the largest brain per body mass of anything. Is that true?
Of anything?
Of any-
Well, I would guess humans have larger. But as Darwin said, the brain of an ant is the most marvelous atom in the universe because of what it can do.
And so, can you talk a little bit about this amazing society of leafcutter ants and how they function together?
Well, the message I always give to folks is that ants are really marvelous because some of them, particularly ones with large societies like the leafcutters, are really much more like humans than chimpanzees. Ants have to figure out all kinds of problems that no chimpanzee has to deal with. And the leafcutter ants is an example. There are lots of differences. They are aliens compared to us, but the similarities are marvelous. And leafcutter ants, for example, we had the video of them carrying leaves, build highways that are very marvelous things. They build about 3 kilometers of highway a year in some colonies. These are colonies, these are pictures of mine from the air in Paraguay showing nests, which are as big as this room and as deep as this room. So these nests are enormous, and that white sand is just something they've brought up from deep below ground. And those are highways going out in all directions. And they're carrying back those leaves you just saw in that previous video. And so in the next picture, we can see what happens. This is below ground, as they say, very complicated architecture, all kinds of work going on there by the ants. We're excavating into this while the soldiers are ripping up our skin. And they have an air conditioning system that keeps everyone cool and oxygen into all those chambers. And the next slide demonstrates what they're doing, and you may not guess why they're doing it quite yet, maybe you know. But they cut up these leaves. Their jaws are about 40% zinc, so they're literally can openers that cut the leaves like this. They actually vibrate their bodies like electric carving knives. And this is a certain kind of ant that's good at this task, and it carries it back to the nest. And it turns out, I think it's shown in the next slide, that they do not eat leaves. It was thought for a while that they might, but what they do is that they're agricultural species that are raising a fully domesticated fungus. Thank you. And this is a fungus that was domesticated many millions of years ago. And the ants have all the elements that you might think of as farming going on here. First, well, they have special problems. They have to reduce those leaves, in this case grass stems, you can see, to a mulch, and then insert fresh fungi, hyphae, in those places, like a farmer would put baby plants down. And then they have to deal with various pests. So they have pesticides and fungicides that get rid of anything that doesn't suit them. And every size of ant, and there are different sizes that do different duties, has a different one of these tasks. The leaf-cutting ants are relatively large, and you go down and down in size till the smallest ants are actually involved with keeping those gardens pure, plucking out anything that doesn't belong there. And the next slide shows that smallest ant doing that task. And this is a domesticated fungus. They domesticated this fungus about 40 million years ago, became fully dependent on the ants. And like domestication in humans, it means that we're doing all the work. The fungus are getting a free ride like the wheat plants are. The wheat plants have conquered the universe because of us. There's so many more wheat plants than anything else. And these fungi actually have little nodes on the tips that have the complete and balanced diet of the ant in them. There's little white globs there that you see in the face of that ant. Gives them anything they need. Next. So this is just going through the story. Now the communication of these ants, they're not brainless, but it's pretty small. And it involves simple signals. I'm particularly interested in identity, how the societies stay apart.
Some of these ants have more muscles in their head than they have brains, actually, right?
They do, yes. And I would think that, I feel like I'm comfortable with that. But the smallest ones probably don't, but the soldiers definitely do. The soldiers are big and dumb.
Yeah.
And they just know how to cut you up as if you were a leaf. And most of these cues are signals are going back and forth between them as they touch each other. And ants can actually determine many things when they're walking down the trails and you see them stop for a second in front of each other. They actually can determine, and shown for some species, what the other ant is doing, and they will assess as they go on what the ants in the colony are doing by the ones walking by and decide themselves what they're going to do that day. And so this leads to a very efficient society. And right down to the last detail on the last slide here, I said that ants are doing all kinds of things that chimpanzees don't do. And I can tell you one thing chimpanzees don't do is worry about public hygiene and health issues. And this is an ant that's a trash collector. And you can become a full-time trash collector in an ant colony. And believe it or not, you can become a specialist at old trash or new trash or moving dead bodies to the grave site. That's a job. And burying this stuff about 30 feet down in some of these large colonies, which is equivalent to us putting our worst hazardous waste 3 kilometers below ground.
Don't give bad ideas.
Oh, yeah. And they build these chambers just for the waste that are as big as a coffin for a small child. Not a nice image, but it's pleasant inside. God. And you can imagine how many millions of years combined of all these thousands and thousands of ants it takes to make a chamber that big, that far underground, just for public health reasons. And the reason for that is the diseases that might carry could destroy the gardens. And these ants live and die down there, producing this into a mulch that becomes harmless. So that's some of the story of how these particular ants work, which are among, of course, the more complicated species out there, which is why I picked them out.
So who's making the decisions? I mean, who's the boss?
Now, and the super intelligent ants would wonder what the heck humans are doing. Apparently, we keep some guy in the White House, and if we just take them out, we can take over the whole country. What is that about? I mean, have you ever tried to stop ants? You can step on them all day in your kitchen, and they're just going to keep coming. And having no leader is a way of being very functional as long as you're organized enough and everyone has enough information to make the right choices appear in aggregate out of all these individuals.
So do you think of each individual ant as like a neuron? Is it kind of...
Well, it's an interesting thing because basically a large ant colony like the leafcutter ants or a large army ant swarm has an aggregate, the same number of neurons that we have in our head, but distributed among many individuals. And so you can ask yourself, what leads to the best result? Putting all our eggs in one basket so that a single bullet in our head can destroy us, or distributing ourselves. I think of it as a kind of Marvel comic superhero. Imagine if you could fall apart into 1,000,000 pieces. You're starving to death, but you fall apart into 1,000,000 pieces, and these little mini brains go out and find food that you could never find underneath things, feed you, and they come back together, and there you are again, and you start composing music or whatever you can do with your brain in one place. Only ants and humans have societies of millions and sometimes billions of individuals. And once you have a lot of individuals, you have to deal with public health issues in a way that no other vertebrate other than humans does. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with the fact you have to put together a society that stays healthy, brainless or not.
Right. Naomi, you've been studying sort of collective behavior of other animals with small to middling-sized brains, like ant swarms, honeybees, schooling fish, bird flocks.
Right.
What do you think we're learning from looking at those kinds of swarming behaviors?
Well, I mean, these starlings are actually stunning, not just beautiful, but remarkable in what they can do. I mean, they inspire me every day. I mean, I started working on these problems in the context of design of sensor networks of robotic vehicles that would go into the ocean to collect data, and thinking about how I would instruct each one, program up their computers so that they would communicate and sense one another and move in patterns to collect data. And if you think about that, going into the ocean, it's crazy hard. There's so much uncertainty, so many things can happen. It's so opaque. And to solve these kinds of problems, I had to make a swarm that would be sensitive to information in the environment that was important, and then also insensitive to all these, uncertainties and perturbations and noise. And when you look at these kinds of bird flocks or fish schools or ant colonies that forage in harsh environments. And I started talking with biologists. I learned that these animals actually balance this kind of trade-off between being able to be super flexible, being able to be super responsive to and sensitive to signals that matter, a predator, food, a migratory route that they have to figure out, and then not be concerned with some kind of disturbance or false positive. It doesn't throw a foul. And so the questions that I've been looking at really reach into both contexts, and actually do use the connection between individuals as neurons and the group as the swarm as a brain, because there's a lot in common in these settings. In the design setting, I'm asking these questions. How do I, give these individuals rules to respond to what they measure about the environment, to respond to what they sense about the neighbors that they can see or hear or communicate with, so that at the level of the group, they're flexible and responsive, but also robust. And in the animal world, the biologists that I work with ask the same kinds of questions, but the opposite direction. So they observe these behaviors, and they want to know what it is that individuals are doing. So what are the underlying responsive behaviors for individual fish or an individual bird? How does it respond to what it senses about its neighbors?
Are they doing similar things? So a school.
Yes, and it's not just that they're moving in beautiful ways. They're actually moving to carry out tasks, or they're carrying out tasks as they move together. Mm-hmm. So what might look like this aerial ballet when you saw the murmuration of starlings, is probably more likely an evasion of a predator as a group, or a foraging activity, or sensing and learning about a migration route, and that's just kind of remarkable that they can do this. And so in my work, so my work is involved in trying to understand, sort of from a mathematical and physical principled perspective, what are those interconnections? What is it, what are the rules that animals are using? What is it about my neighbor that elicits a response? If Simone starts running this way, am I going to follow him? And what if Mark runs the other way? Do I split in half?
Run away this way because Mark is...
Yeah, don't get us started.
Or what if, or the kinds of questions that you were asking. What if there's food over here, or there's something scary over here, but my neighbor goes this way? Should I, do what this other plant is doing, or should I, go after what I think is better? So how does that work? How, in the case of the starlings, we ask these questions. If they're in the middle of the flock and all they can sense are their neighbors, how is it that they're ever going to be able to avoid the predator? So then maybe we have to understand what's the shape of the flock, because if the shape is like a big sphere, then a whole bunch of them are inside and don't know anything. But if it's more like a sheet, then almost everybody is kind of on the periphery and can know things.
So the number 7, I understand, is kind of an important number.
So in the case of the starlings, a group of physicists wrote a beautiful paper claiming that each bird was paying attention to its 6 or 7 closest neighbors. And they explained that by looking where their neighbors were located. So the first closest, the second closest, the third closest were in very particular places. They tended to be on the sides rather than front and back or top and bottom. But when they got up to 8 and 9, it just kind of didn't matter. It was sort of arbitrary where you would find the 8th or 9th. And when I met them, they told me this whole story. And of course, I asked, well, why? So what's special about 6 or 7? Okay, I believe you. Your argument seems plausible. And so we went ahead and looked literally at these. If you take a whole set of points of where they are, and you draw arrows to the 6 or 7 closest ones, you get a network. Mm-hmm. And then you say, well, for that network, how well, if I give it some basic rules, how well will it perform sticking together, flying around like that, in the presence of uncertainty? And I can ask the same question if they only pay attention to 5 or 4 or 3 or 8 or 9 or 10. And what we found was that 6 or 7 actually is, for the way they distribute themselves, the most efficient way to manage the uncertainty. So it's sort of, there's evidence that there's a reason for it. It might not be the only reason, but one can ask those kinds of questions using these kind of mathematics and physical principles.
Are you using that now in your work with robotics too?
Absolutely, yeah. So the idea is to sort of extract out from what we learn through evidence in the natural systems and translate that into design. Because honestly, the things that I learned that animals can do, I cannot imagine dreaming up a way to make it happen in the design world. So I'm every day fascinated and then inspired by new ways of doing things. And so these same kind of rules we use to design our robots in the ocean and elsewhere. Mm. Absolutely.
Is 6 and 7 maybe a number that's related to how much brain it takes to pay attention to that many? You can't go beyond that because it gets too complicated?
I mean, I think there's still open questions about, this is a really important question, one that we look at, which is, who are your neighbors? Are you looking at them all the time? Are you constantly looking at 6 or 7? Are you kind of getting an average of where the 6 or 7 are? Or are you taking turns, maybe looking at this one, then this one, and this one?
Keeping some in memory,
right.
But not many can fit.
You also have evidence now, like in fish and human beings, that we're actually not paying attention to particular individuals, but more like the movement that they perform on a visual field. And so
there's also what you do with that information. I think one of the things that we're doing now is not just relying on kind of like, oh, you're pulling me this way, you're pulling me that way, but through this analog with the neuronal dynamics, it's that there's sort of an excitability in the same way like a neuron firing excites another neuron to fire. So it's not just that you pull me this way, but I'm sort of more excited about whatever activity we're doing because you're excited or more not. Excited. Or maybe you're excited, I get less excited. But it gives us a lot more meat to be able to explain things like those super fast movements that you see in fish schools and cascades that you see. I mean, you can't do that with these just sort of spring-like, you pull me this way, I pull you that way.
That's something that fascinates me in the birds. Right? Something you have to understand is that they fly maybe 20, 30 centimeters apart at 30, 35 miles per hour, and they can turn almost on the spot, and they don't collide with each other.
Yeah.
And that's something that the speed at which the brain needs to process that kind of information is just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's an example of intelligence without a brain. I mean, the individual birds are not unintelligent, but the group
has its own intelligence.
Yeah, it's bigger than the sum of its parts. It has its own intelligence.
And I guess there is another element, kind of the other side of the coin as well, is that not all individuals, although they are cooperating in this moving together, they're all different.
Exactly.
So even those rules, because they're all different, the rules remain flexible because of the individuality that is present in the group, which is actually the power of the group.
Yeah, and I think that's a new topic. I think people have been ignoring that for so long.
Well, I mean,
but you know, this
I
idea.
wouldn't say they have been ignoring that. It's just the methodology they've used. I mean, that's going to be.
It's challenging.
The methodology they've used sort of went like averaged everything.
Exactly. So squashed it.
Squashed thing. In the modeling
yeah.
methods we use, they squashed this viability.
Yeah.
But it was there. It's just
Of
at the
course.
time you didn't have maybe the tools or the computing power to actually take into account the viabilities in your models.
And I mean, I guess this is what we actually do in general, right? We look at our numbers,
But it's a general training.
and we're just trying to get those errors to be as small as possible, right? And of course, there is a reason you don't want to add the error in your studies, but also like some of that variability is exactly what makes the system to work.
Exactly. I totally agree.
It's a general trend in the sciences right now where you want to show the entire distribution of your data, because a lot of the viability is actually extremely important to explain
what's happening.
Yeah. If you just look at the mean, you actually miss a lot of the information.
Yeah.
Like you miss everything that's happening at the extreme, which sometimes is, especially in our times, very important.
A lot of these things have to do with motion and space and the relationships between organisms in your case. And to me, that's really one of the other things I work on is canopy biology. And that's the formations of plants in a rainforest or other communities. And you end up with this labyrinth, which is an architectural marvel that various creatures have to move through. And one of them are some of them are the plants. And I've worked a fair amount with some of the people working on them. And one fellow, Tom Ray, was working on the philodendrons. And they're amazing because what happens with a philodendron is a bird will drop a seed to the ground and it sprouts and it moves directly towards the nearest tree trunk in the dark in the understory. Somehow it knows where that tree trunk is, presumably because of the quality of light. And it climbs up the tree, but what becomes amazing is that it grows 2 or 3 meters long and it loses the tail going to the earth, and it stays 2 or 3 meters long and moves through the forest like a snake in super slow motion. And it has to choose where to go. And every bifurcation up there, all these labyrinths of architecture, it has to go through that. And what happens if it reaches a spot that's in the shade, it grows very fast with small leaves. And when it's in a sunny spot, it grows these enormous leaves like you see in the philodendrons in your doctor's office. And if it gets to the top of the tree and tries to cross to the next tree, it'll make a leader shoot that extends out, and it'll actually try to reach the next tree, and it will grow out several feet and drop, and eventually hold on to the other side, and it'll cross to the next tree. But if it loses its grip and falls, now if an orchid up in the top of a tree falls to the ground, it's dead. It's not going anywhere. But these philodendrons simply uncoil themselves, moves to the nearest tree trunk, and start up again. And so all these things in the plant world, too, are this dynamic thing that if you could speed up time, there's this life and death and chaos going on.
I'm slightly panicked now.
Everywhere. Thank goodness. Well, there are trees that crush other trees to death, so that you don't want to be standing there for too many years.
Just one more data point. That's all I need.
So it sounds like we should move beyond the kind of neuronal brain-centered definition of intelligence. I mean, why have we been so neuronal? I think, Simone, I saw something where you were talking about how a neuron in a dish is a stupid thing, doesn't do anything. But
doesn't do much, yes.
Yeah, so we kind of imbue it with this power of consciousness and all that. But it isn't, it's just a cell.
Well, I mean, part of what biology is sort of getting at right now is the idea is that the unit is not what's important, it's the interactions between the many units. Right, so the intelligence doesn't live in the neuron. Like something is in the neuron, there's some activity there. But what's important is who this neuron is connected to and how many of them, and how the behavior of one neuron impacts the behavior of the other neurons. And if it's properly set up, that can generate circuits and feedbacks, positive and negative, that then become the substrate for storing memories or for remembering things or solving optimization problems, etc., etc. So I think that's one of the big changes in the field in biology in general, but in science in general over the past, let's say, 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's this beautiful kind of,
Yeah.
the scales kind of repeat, so that the elements at one level, at the fine scale, become the coarse here, but then those themselves are the fine level for the next level up, right?
And at every level,
it just
that's
keeps going, right, until you get to these populations of...
Right.
And at every level, it's the interactions between these things which creates what's at the level above. And we are more and more understanding that it's what, I mean, at least that's my personal opinion.
There's a lot of open questions.
That the interaction is what is extremely important.
Yeah.
I feel like the neuronal model is a good one, but it's really familiar to us, and so we like it.
I would stretch that to a little bit further. It's not that it's just familiar to us. It's like it is all about us.
We think
so
it's
like
best.
it must be the best.
Yes, and therefore almost the only definition we've worked with for a while.
Exactly.
We need to expand
It's a
that
very
out.
anthropocentric
Yeah,
space, basically.
that's one way to put it.
And
yes.
we just use that as the golden standard to measure everything against.
Yeah.
Instead of like, it's just one model. And how beautiful. You know, it's not making a less or more. It's just like, how beautiful. And there are, like, the beauty is that there are so many other ways to do exactly the same task in so many different combinations.
You can always bring back everything to networks.
Exactly.
Networks of interactions between
Exactly.
all these different parts. So I think that's where the neuronal model is not wrong. I mean, it's not wrong because it's what it is, right? It's a network.
It's just a model.
But we realize that as long as you have a network like this, whatever it's made of, whether it's made of neurons,
Who cares?
then who cares, exactly.
What about
This network is going to generate this emergent property that sometimes are intelligent.
Emergent, yes.
Sorry, I didn't want to
Consciousness.
say the E word.
No, it's a good word. What about consciousness? I mean, do you think that
The C word.
the C word, yeah. You think that, like,
We're allowed to say this.
Sorry, but I can't swear. I'm told not to swear, so can't talk about it.
I think we're going to turn around and let...
do you think do they have some self-awareness? I mean, is an ant self-aware? Is a tree self-aware?
Well, one really interesting thing about, am I self-aware?
No.
Give me a mirror.
Thank you for taking the heat for everyone. Yeah.
One interesting thing about humans is we take a lot of information from our faces. So a person who has a neurological problem and can't express emotion, we attribute to them fewer emotions. And an attribute of ants, if you've looked at them closely, is they have fixed faces. So the question is, what's going on there? And you know, when I do photography of ants for National Geographic with my research too, and if I'm stalking an ant, I have a high magnification camera, and I'm looking at that ant behind a leaf. I can tell by the tense of, how its body tenses and how it turns that it knows that I'm there. And you know, basically,
He's doing this?
she.
Yeah.
All she. But you know, it's interesting to know that because that's how, if you look back at hunter-gatherers and descriptions of how they hunted, that's how they dealt with other animals. Anthropomorphism was how we moved through the world, and if you do it smartly, you can learn things from it.
Yeah.
And so hunters would know from the footprints where that animal was going to go, whether it was in a hurry, whether it was horny, whatever was going on. And, you know, I've been with them, and it's just amazing to see what information they pull up. Maybe it's not accurate, but it still gets them the result, and that in itself tells you something interesting as a starting point for thinking about how those animals behave. And maybe plants. I don't know if hunter-gatherers sit around and watch plants grow, but
I'm sure they did.
Just for a long time. Very long.
One question I have about this, and that is, do you think that this has any ethical implications? If you're going to have to kill to eat, as we do, is it more ethical to kill a plant than an animal?
Ethics belongs to a human world. So we should acknowledge that first, that we're talking about not what the plant feels or the animal feels, but when we talk about ethics, we're talking about how we behave towards the world. Right? And so the question really is like, are we justifying misconduct our own behavior. Because if we are even asking the question, is this ethical, is maybe because we already know that it's not. Otherwise, we wouldn't be asking it. And maybe some people don't ask it, and that's okay. Maybe they have a easier life. But I think as a group, as a collective, obviously this question arises over and over again, whether we're talking about farming of animals, whether we're talking about farming of plants. And so the fact that the question is actually there is because fundamentally we have an issue with our behavior. And to me, I am vegan. And, I have eaten the animals, then no animals, but, just as a vegetarian. Then I moved on to a vegan diet just because my body decided so. And then what I understood for myself is that actually the main issue, and the main reason why I had an ethical issue with eating animals was because of my lack of awareness of how this animal arrived to me. And the fact that, and my mom still, we were talking about it this morning, afternoon, in a different session. My mom still thinks that salami is not an animal. And I'm like, I don't eat meat. And it's like, yeah, but this is salami. It's like, okay, then I don't eat salami. But that's exactly the point. It's like salami is not an animal. So I don't have any need to worry about what the story is behind this. But when you actually concern yourself for, when you really tune in with this body and you're really interested to know, who are you? What is this? What are you made of? And I think as a scientist, ultimately, the only question that we are all asking is like, what is this? Life, whatever. And so, the closest place that I found for myself personally is via the conversation via food. It's like, okay, I take this other and I get it in here, and that other is making this, basically.
Right.
So even the concept of like, I'm a human being is like, well, how much of this is actually plant material? Really, mostly, because I only eat plants. And so the question is like this transmutation of one organism into the other, which, suggests that actually we have, the entire system is very porous and very mutable and volatile. And but also like then even more reason to be not only respectful and appreciative of the fact that, this other is gonna make your body next because your body is being rebuilt all the time. Right. But also like, then you wanna make sure that what you put in here is actually clean and good and happy in a way. So you don't want to have to eat an animal that has been through horror and suffering. Because in a way, that's what you're eating.
Yeah.
And the same would be true for plants. So it's not so much whether you're eating meat or not. Actually, I wouldn't call it whether you're eating the animal or whether you're eating the plant or both. It's more like, do you actually know what you're eating? And if you don't, then start thinking about it.
Okay. So I think we're just about out of time, but I did want to take a couple of questions from the audience. So.
I was wondering, much of what all of you mentioned has to do with collaboration, and collaboration being as a trait for intelligence. Now, is that collaboration affected by the harshness of an environment? For example, the flock of birds, if they were in a super comfortable position, would they still collaborate?
Ooh, that's a very interesting question.
If we talk about the flock of birds, or actually a lot of these flocks in schools, is the predominant theory to explain how they form. It's because they were responding to predation. You can actually create a mathematical model where the only pressure you put is predation, they will evolve this schooling and flocking behaviors. So the question whether if you relax that pressure, they will go back to live by themselves, it's possible because there's a lot of cost of living in groups, right? You have to compete for your food with people around you. You have to compete for the mates that are around you. You have to compete for space. There's a lot of disadvantages like infanticides in certain animal societies, etc. I mean, we see it like nepotism is a form of that in the human societies where we try to advantage or take advantage of the system for our kids.
But there are advantages too.
There are advantages, but the question in
so
this
if you can't
particular
find
system,
the food by yourself, and you need somebody else to find it.
So the question is, if that's predation that's only driving the system, then yes, this system will probably go back to being solitary. But then there are things also when you've reached this point where you live together, and it's in the case of in the ants, for instance, you reach this point where the advantage is when you pass that sort of like evolutionary hump. Behind the hump, there's like so many advantages that you can actually the original pressure can disappear, and then you never go back. I mean, that's what like E.O. Wilson probably or...
Yeah, well, I just did a book on societies and where they come from and what causes them to come together and fall apart. And societies as groups with distinct memberships, those are extremely rare in nature. Most, 99% of the species are alone all the time or just temporarily social when they need to be. So this is actually a tough hurdle, but as you say, once you get there, you can conquer the world. We in ourselves are societies because our own bodies are consisting of cells that are totally in collaboration to get something done. So we are the most successful societies, all these large organisms that are around. The actual insects and all the other large creatures that we see mostly are loners. So.
Okay. And I guess, sorry if I might add, it depends really, like we've been talking about time scales, but it also really depends where is the scale of the question. So ultimately, like, this entire place is based on primarily collaboration. And competition is as important though. So competition creates that noise that is required to create the variability that allows for the system to be dynamic. And then it finds places where it can collaborate. Our bodies are a good example, and places where things don't collaborate very well. And in some situation, when that collaboration breaks down, as we know in our body, cancer does that very well, then it can kill everything. But actually, life seems not to just die off like that. So maybe the two forces are working together, but I would say that collaboration is very important. Beyond just like, there is it's advantageous because when you are collaborating as a group, you can survive better as from a predator.
Leaving the population level, collaboration's also the perceived collaboration is really important to mycorrhizal networks and our microbiome. Mm-hmm. We're not just human here, right? Yeah. And so there are a lot of functions and a lot of, shall we say, niche space that's being fulfilled not by us, but by other organisms in our bodies. And is that a perception or is that a reality? Do the bacteria want our brains to get bigger? For instance, just to put it in a very stark way.
I think it also gets back to heterogeneity and individual differences. So if we're all going to be able to do the same thing, then maybe we don't need to collaborate. But if we are different and we have different expertise, then it makes a lot of sense.
Like ants with this super specialized kind of.
Right, which emerges as their colonies get bigger and bigger and things get more and more complex. That's when it becomes interesting. That's when they become more and more sort of, the parallels become more and more interesting with us.
So there's selection pressure towards a job.
Not necessarily. There are ants with huge colonies where everyone is pretty much the same, but they're not very interesting socially to study. But these leafcutter ants are among the most extreme, and as I said, you can tell what they do by their size, just as you can tell what people do by whether they're wearing the hard hat and have the lunch pail or looking like a lawyer or whatever. And ants, it's size and shape. I'm just looking like I should be in the jungle, which is ironically where I should be. So.
Well, I think we have to wrap it up now. And I want to thank everybody for coming. It's been great.